Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. This is going to be about the books that I read in the months of April and May. If you're new to my channel, my name is Lillian and I like recording just these short videos discussing the books that I've read. I read a lot of fiction, nonfiction about Singapore, sci-fi, and memoirs. So if that's something that's interesting to you, feel free to hit the subscribe button. The first book I want to talk about is called The Scarlet Pimpernel. It was published in 1905 and written by Baroness Orczy. So this is a bit more of a historical novel. Definitely you have to take it within the context of the time period that it was written in. And interestingly, it's set during the late 18th century during the French Revolution. And it follows this character, the Scarlet Pimpernel, who is helping aristocrats who are being persecuted during the French Revolution to escape to England. You essentially follow the story of the main character, Marguerite, who is kind of caught up in these various plots and actions to try and save these Frenchmen and these aristocrats. And throughout, the writing is kind of that style that's very descriptive but also clever, and was really kind of a fun, enjoyable read. I kind of had a couple of qualms with the plot. For example, there is kind of a key plot device where the Scarlet Pimpernel has a dual personality, and I think throughout it was very easy to quickly guess who the kind of other alternate persona was, and it was pretty easy to kind of figure out what was going to happen next. But I do think if you take it in the context of the time it was written, this was probably one of the first examples of kind of the Superman dual personality type of plot device. And so it was kind of a fun read in the sense of it was very plot driven, and there was a lot of kind of snarky dialogue that happens back and forth, some political commentary. My other kind of gripe with it would be the fact that Marguerite was very reactive in the entire novel. So she has a few scenes where she kind of has to carry out the wishes of certain characters, and she kind of acts as a spy as these intrigues are going on. But for the most part, she kind of is just the vessel through which we see the events unfold in the plot, and she doesn't really have a lot of her own intention or her own drive in moving the story forward. In general, I really do like novels that were written around the turn of the century because I just feel that the writing, there's a lot more thought and care that's put into making it clever, and just the style of novels at that time were very clever in general, I guess, and just kind of the language that's used and the devices and the sentence structure. And so even though the plot was a little bit unbelievable at times, that's kind of all part of the genre and all part of the fun. So I will give this a 3.9 out of 5. The second book I want to speak about is called Leaving the Atocha Train Station, and that was written by Lerner in 2011. It's a first-person account, and it follows the story of a young man who's a poet who's in Madrid doing a fellowship and feels very listless and depressed, I would say, and kind of aimless as he's trying to figure out, you know, what's his purpose in life, what is the purpose of his art, of his craft, and comes from a very privileged upbringing, I would say. Like, he's a typical white guy who has loving parents, but still finds that he has a lot of disgust for, you know, mainstream art or mainstream points of view, but then at the same time feels like a fraud himself and is very insecure at the heart of it. This is the kind of book where you're just completely exposed to the inner workings of the main character's mind and his almost internal dialogue. There's definitely sometimes a feeling of pretension in how self-aware the narration is. Like, it's very indulgent, and I think it's kind of hot or cold. Like, sometimes it's too much, and I just think, like, why do I care about this white guy abroad who's like just having sex with different women and sitting in the park, getting high and like reading Tolstoy, and it just feels very like self-indulgent, I guess. But at other times, having such a realistic interiority to the main character feels very realistic and very charming, and it resonates with me when there's something that's put on the page that is something I myself have felt or have thought, and then you start to get like that connection between having the thoughts and self-awareness of the main character completely exposed to maybe things that you've also felt. But still, part of me is like, okay, yet another novel that's about the craft and about like self-hate and dread and existential fear. A little bit, it just feels like almost too much like put on, and just that kind of stereotypical like artist intellectual masturbation, where you kind of feel like he only has these problems because he's like thinking up these problems for himself. A lot of like paranoid interior dialogue, a lot of like questions about whether he's a fraud or not. You get all of his fears, his self-loathing. I mean, you're basically living in his brain. So sometimes it's annoying, sometimes it's super relatable. Sometimes he'll say something that seems beautiful and true and really connects with me, and sometimes you just roll your eyes. So that's why I feel like it's kind of on or off when it comes to that style of writing. I think maybe I would have liked this book more if I could have seen myself in the central character. So perhaps it's not the fact that the style was so much the issue, but just that I couldn't relate to him as much. I do think I sometimes like books that are full of constant complaining or incessant self-narration, but just the fact that it's kind of this like mediocre white male put me off a little bit. But in general, I did enjoy it just because I liked the vibes. I liked hearing about kind of this, fellowship lifestyle abroad, overseas. He's also in Madrid when the train bombings happen, so that's something that's not like the main focus of the book, but kind of plays a part in his journey, I guess. I wouldn't say there's like a big arc of self-discovery, but there's definitely a lot of self-reflection and a lot of mulling over kind of the stories we tell other people, what does it mean to have an authentic identity, and the role that poetry and art plays in that. There's kind of a central theme of the main character, Adam Gordon is his name, always saying that his Spanish is not very good, and him thinking to himself, my poetry is horrible. But then by the end of the book, you realize like, okay, based on what other characters are saying, his Spanish does seem to be fluent, and his poetry does seem to be legitimate enough to be recognized by this fellowship. And so that central theme of us feeling completely and utterly insufficient compared to how we might actually be in the real world and how other people view us, I think is a quite existential question, and one that is a little bit depressing to think about, but also that makes a lot of sense if you are a poet. But anyway, I did enjoy kind of going down the rabbit hole of his thought processes and his self-doubt and kind of his aimless life trying to, not really trying to do anything. I mean, he's just kind of like thinking and existing. He has like some love interests. He has some deep thoughts about art and poetry, and he goes on these trips, but a lot of it is just his kind of self-loathing and paranoia, his dependence on tranquilizers and drugs. And by the end of it, I do think you get a little bit of not a redemption, but just kind of self-discovery. I think it's very autobiographical, if I had to guess, because I think Ben Lerner is also a poet. This is his debut novel. I also don't know if I was like in the best mind space to be reading something like this, but I think I did take from it what I could, and I will give it a 4 out of 5. The book that I read about Singapore over the last couple of months is called Living with Myths in Singapore. It's a compilation edited by Seng, Thum, and Meng-Tat Chia. And this was a honker. This took me such a long time to read. My main impression is I kind of feel like forcing every essay contributor to use the framework of myths was a little bit forced. And I'm not sure if it was necessary, but it kind of, I guess, is the whole thread that connects all these essays. But if you kind of take that away and just think about certain content and arguments that these essay contributors wanted to bring, some of them were really interesting and really illuminating. My recommendation for this book is to definitely just go through the table of contents and pick a particular topic that you're interested in and just read those chapters. I read everything, but some of them were interesting, some of them were extremely insightful, some of them helped me fill in some gaps around my knowledge around Singapore politics, history, literature, education, legal system, all of that. But I don't think there is a coherence or overall argument that requires you to read every essay. This is definitely more like a buffet, and it's definitely a menu of, if you're interested in, say, the development of media in Singapore, then just read that chapter. Or you're interested in literature in Singapore, read that chapter. Now, did those chapters have to use the framing of these are the myths that were told in that area? I don't know that it was really necessary. Sometimes the concept of myth was used so much that it lost its meaning almost, because every essay contributor had to frame it like these are the myths. But that aside, I do think the overall myths that are covered in this kind of compendium were really interesting. So I can share what those big buckets were. The first collection of myths is the Singapore story. And so all of these essays talk about the use of a cohesive narrative, the Singapore story, by the PAP government, also by other parts of civil society, but mostly like government adjacent organizations, especially the idea that Singapore went from third world to first, that it was very streamlined in its development, and that there's kind of this singular historical narrative of how Singapore came to be and kind of the greatness of the economic development that happened. To me, the best articulation of actual founding myths that are behind the Singapore story came in the essay by Thum, and he talks about 3 myths. First, the myth of vulnerability, which is that Singapore's survival is never assured because the country is small, susceptible to external threats, and composed of a volatile mix of ethnicities and religions. I definitely see that coming through in a lot of the government language and kind of the framing of Singapore's development. Definitely during National Day speeches, language from the government, you hear all about how Singapore is in kind of this precarious state. The second myth he talks about is development, which is we should judge the legitimacy of our government in terms of economic performance, and kind of the idea that that is the most important metric. And then third is meritocracy. So that's the myth that anyone can rise to leadership in Singapore based on their ability, regardless of their lineage, social connections, race, or religion. The next big bucket of myths that are discussed are around vulnerability and fault lines. And there are a few different essays that I learned a lot from. One about trade unions and the idea that they were anti-nationalist, clamped down on the Law Society of Singapore. So that was interesting to understand how the legal profession in around pre-independence and independence times was actually a lot more autonomous, and now has kind of been folded into the government and was cracked down on by the PAP government. Also, the idea that other countries like South Korea have been able to democratize a little bit. So the argument or the myth that Singapore cannot do that or else it will lose its economic development is not valid. It talks about kind of the other fault lines, so to speak, in Singapore, including the racial categorization CMIO, which stands for Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other, and also the idea of heritage and multiculturalism. A lot of these essays I thought provided a good background. Some of them had really interesting arguments. Others were kind of more a synopsis or a summary of events or research that these authors had done to those topics. The final category of myths is called a deficient people. So the essays in this section talk about the myth that Singaporeans are apathetic or that they don't want to be politically engaged. One of the essays looks at the history of student activism in Singapore. And then there's kind of like a hodgepodge, like there's an essay about poverty, which is written by Teo Yo-Yen, who is very well known for her work in inequality studies. I really enjoyed the chapter about migrant workers because that's just an issue that I'm interested in. And so that essay talks about kind of the myths that surround the idea of imported labor, including the myth that, you know, these migrant workers make enough money to then be rich in their home countries, the myth that they're kind of a threat or a cause of instability in Singaporean society, and the myth that they're mistreated by only a bad batch, a bad handful of errant employers, when actually there are a lot of systemic causes for the mistreatment of migrant workers. And so that's kind of what I mean about this like false framing. Like, there are two ways you could frame that, right? You could make the argument there are a lot of systemic issues that affect migrant workers in Singapore, but because the framing of this entire essay collection is that we have to talk about myths, it's then reframed as like there's a myth that only a handful of bad actors are actually mistreating migrant workers. And so that's one way to frame it, but it's not necessarily the most straightforward or the most compelling way to frame it. So I did kind of have an issue with every single essay contributor having to frame things as myths. It just kind of sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, sometimes just felt really artificial. And I don't know if there would have been a better way of bringing together these essays, or actually what I would have suggested is if you're gonna call this Living with Myths in Singapore, really culling out any essays that aren't directly tied to fundamental myths. I think there are too many essays in this collection to really build up to a single cohesive, like these are the main myths that are pervading Singaporean society and historical understanding. And instead it kind of tries to cover as much as possible and is a big grab bag of different topics, and then each of the contributors then has to like come up with what is the myth and then unpack it in that manner. So overall, I'm really glad I read this. I think it's a great supplement to my Singapore understanding, but I'm not sure it was the most effective execution of what they were trying to do in pulling together all of these different myths. I think it worked maybe like 60% of the way through, but not for everything. So I'm gonna rate this a 3.9 out of 5. The last book I'm gonna talk about is called Kingdom of Heroes by Phillips. I'll just briefly mention this. It was self-published. It was a really like a train wreck of a book. I think this guy who's like obsessed with superheroes just decided to like throw his hat into the ring and write his own story. It had like super sexualized female characters who are superheroes. The male gaze was insane and the plot kind of made no sense. He also, all of his superheroes were kind of just cribbed off of existing ones. So like there was an Iron Man character, there was like a Superman character, but he just slightly changed the names. So I definitely would not recommend reading this, but it was part of our book club selections because we had the theme of superheroes, and one of my book club members found a list and somehow this book made it onto this list. The only thing I can say is like, hey, it's hard to write a book and I've never written a book, even a fan fiction, so kudos to this guy for at least writing it, but it only cost 99 cents on Kindle and there's a reason why. So I'll give it like a 1 out of 5. So that's it for the months of April and May. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a thumbs up, and I look forward to chatting with you guys about the books that I read in the month of June.